Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to move your Capsim course online. My name is Eric Smith, and I manage the Client Relationship Department at Capsim. With us today, we have Dr. Tawnya Means. Dr. Means is the Assistant Dean and the Director of the Teaching and Learning Center for the College of Business at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research interests include online and blended learning, active learning, learning space design, technology for teaching, access to digital learning, and faculty preparation to teach. Now, Dr. Means is also what we consider a Capsim power user. She has many years of experience using a variety of Capsim simulations in her courses. Today, Dr. Means is going to share one of those courses with us and explain how to make an online course be just as engaging as a face-to-face course with a simulation. Now, before we begin, I'd like to ask everybody to please share your feedback with us. After watching the webinar today, if there are any challenges or questions that you still have regarding your transition to a virtual environment, please click on the link in the chat and share your concerns with us. Your feedback will help determine the focus of future webinars. Now, without any further delay, Dr. Means, please take it away.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks so much for having me and for allowing me to share with you some of the things that I do in my course. I really do feel like that this is an opportunity for people to be able to rethink what they're doing with their teaching. And in many cases, a lot of the things that people can do in their face-to-face course can be done online. And so I'd like to share with you all some things that I've done and some lessons that I've learned and some ways that you can both effectively and efficiently use a simulation in an online course. So with that, I'd like you to just think about, the first question when you start thinking about moving things to online is you start thinking, can I even do this? I really like the face-to-face environment. I enjoy the interaction with my students. I feel like I can very naturally engage them in the activities that I need to engage them in order for them to learn. I can see whether or not they're participating equally. I can see whether they're sharing the load and whether they're interacting with each other in teams. And it's much more natural for us to do it in a face-to-face environment. But I want to share with you that most of the things that you do in an online or in a face-to-face environment, you can actually do in an online environment. It just takes a little bit of considerations for how you translate those activities. So some of the considerations that I would share with you, first of all, is for each goal of your for each activity within your course, if you identify the goal of that activity, you can start to think about how you would translate that activity into an online version. In this case, what you're trying to do is almost create modules or bites of your course in which you break things apart into pieces and try to examine each of those pieces individually, as opposed to looking at the course as more of a whole. One of the biggest reasons for using a simulation is the engagement that it allows you to have with the students and the engagement that students have in the learning process. It's not about them just listening to you lecture. It's not about them just reading the textbook. It's not about them just reading cases or even talking to each other. The simulation allows them to have experiences that they share with each other and that they hopefully learn from as they iterate through and do things on a continuous basis and include reflection on those activities in order to be able to learn. And so you want to make sure that those things that happen in the simulation are leveraged in an online environment. And there's some really great ways that you can ensure the engagement of your students through this process and through using technology. Some of the things that you need to consider when you're thinking about the engagement is which type of simulation to use. I've used many of Capsim simulations. I've also used simulations from other companies, and it's important for you to think about the simulation that you're using. What are the features of that simulation? What is the interface of the simulation, and how does that relate to what I'm trying to accomplish with the students? I've used the simulations with both graduate and undergraduate students, and in fact with executive education as well. And what you want to consider here in this area is, what am I trying to accomplish with a graduate student that's different than an undergraduate student, that's different from someone who's participating in some kind of an executive education program or professional development? Some of the simulations are more complex and work better if you have students who have more experience. And some of them are a simpler interface and easier for less experienced students to grasp and to understand what's happening. You also want to consider the number of students that are engaged in the course. If you have a high enrollment of 150 students, it's going to be challenging to do some of the activities, but it's going to be easier to do some of the other activities. And if you have a smaller class of, 10 or 15 students, then you're going to start trying to figure out, well, how do I make the best use of the simulation to allow the students to have the kinds of experiences I want them to have. I already mentioned just a little bit the background and experience of students. In an undergraduate course, typically the students don't have a lot of working experience. And so they're going to need something that is a little bit less complex, that has less of a requirement for them to actually have working experience that they can apply to the simulation. Whereas if you're working with a graduate capstone course, most of those students will have considerable amount of work experience. They will have a number of different courses that fill the different, that are the background for the different departments that they'll have to make decisions. And it can be a little bit easier for them to do something more complex, to build in a global aspect of it, or to build in HR, or to build in total quality management, or things like that. Another consideration to make is whether you want your students to work in teams or to be individual in their work. It is possible to run the simulation completely with the students as individuals and have it be completely self-paced and allow them to work completely on their own. And in some cases, this might be preferable. In other cases, it's the team experience that's the most important. And so you want to be able to use teams in ways that they share the load with each other. And I'll talk some about the many different ways that you can do that. One thing is to consider how big your teams are. If you have 4 departments and you have 4 students, one of the tendencies is for the students to say, well, I'll take marketing, you take R&D, you take production, and you take finance. And they will do the divide and conquer aspect of the teamwork instead of actually being teams. And so if you have teams that are smaller than 4, or if you have teams that are larger than 4, it actually requires them to do more sharing. And I'll talk some more in a little bit about how you build those team structures in place in order to be able to encourage the students to work together as opposed to divide and conquer. The timeline of the course, or the length, whether it's a 5-week course, a 6-week course, an 8-week course, a 10-week course, or a full semester course, will have an impact on how much you can accomplish in the course. If you have a very fast course, then it's going to mean that you're going to have to get everybody up and running very quickly, and you may have to do multiple rounds in a week. In the beginning, that's a little bit challenging because the students are just getting prepared and they're just learning the interface, and it's hard for them to really do more than one in a period of time. But if you notice as you get further along, sometimes you can do more rounds in a week just because the students are more accustomed to how to make the decisions, or more accustomed to the interface. It's also really important that you do at least a certain number of rounds, I would say at least 6 rounds, in order for the students to recognize some of the things that happen over time. So the simulation is designed to have a round be a year, and if they only have to go through 3 or 4 rounds, that's often not enough time for some of the simulation strategies to be actually played out, and it's also sometimes not enough time for them to recognize that some of the bad decisions they were making early on have long-lasting impacts. So it's important for enough rounds to be completed for them to learn from that. A few other considerations in relation to the choices that you make. First of all, I want to express that this takes time. You are not going to be perfect at this the very first time you put it out. And in fact, when you probably implemented a simulation in your face-to-face environment, it wasn't perfect the first time. It was just a little bit more natural for you to adjust on the fly. In this case, online, it's going to take you a little bit of time. And so I try to tell people, just try one new thing. If you have a structure that you want to put in place, set that structure, and then the next time you teach the course, try to adjust one thing. And then the next time, try to adjust one more thing. And over time, you'll establish a way that feels really natural and comfortable for you. Secondly, I encourage you to plan for flexibility. Not all of the students are going to always stay right on track, and not all of the students are going to be able to figure out the interface right away. And so you're going to need a little bit of flexibility, but in the same thing, you're going to need accountability for the students. So you have to put things in place in order to have them pull their own weight, prepare ahead of time, and be accountable for the decisions that they make. Often the way that I do that, I'll describe some of the steps in a little bit, but often the way that I do that is I tell them the simulation is going to run and it's going to close at a certain time, and the round is going to process at that time, and I will not make adjustments. A lot of the other things in the course, I will make adjustments around it if you are traveling or have emergencies or things like that, but the simulation has to go forward. And that's typically because they're all in an industry together. And if I roll back the decisions for one team, it rolls it back for everyone. And I want them to recognize the ramifications for not being responsible or preparing. And then the other thing to really pay attention to is that students will hesitate to ask for help until it's too late to make a decision or to make a change on their decisions. And so there are ways that you can put into your course checkpoints in which the students are almost forced to ask for help. And this will help them to not get to round 4 and recognize, oh my gosh, I've been making this terrible decision time after time, and there's just no way of coming back from it. And so I'm just going to throw up my hands and walk away and let it self-process for the rest of the rounds because I'm going to fail anyway. And so rather than have that happen, it's really important to get the students to actually ask for help earlier. So let me walk through my course just a little bit. I'm going to be showing you some pieces and parts of the course and highlighting some of the ways that I feel like help the students to be successful with the simulation. This is a graduate level course. It is a capstone course in our online MBA. And it is a course that students take at the very end of their MBA program. So they've already completed courses in our core and a lot of their electives, and they're pretty much ready to graduate after this course. They also, in our program, have in our course, they also have a number, in our program, they also have a number of years of experience, and so I'm able to rely on that. So in the syllabus, I have an overview of the course. I give them some information about how to get started. I give them some information, just an overview of why the course is important, and I talk about the topics and the due dates that they will have. I try to outline for them very clearly the assignments that are going to be happening and what they need to be doing, and aligning that with what they're supposed to read or videos that they're supposed to watch or things like that. I also have the information for them about how to access Capsim and the eText bundle. So I actually have them purchase it together so that they can have both in the same environment. And then I give them expectations for how they will participate in the course. And that includes outlining for them the balance of the team versus the individual activities that they're going to be doing. So in this course, I have them do activities as a team, and I've outlined for them what type of activities they're going to be doing as a team. And then I also make sure that they're doing some things as an individual so that they are earning points that they can control themselves. I try to balance out the percentages of their grade that are happening with any one activity. The strategy selection at the very beginning is just getting them started. The simulation itself is worth 30% of their grade, and that's from 1 point that's towards them doing some practice rounds, 24 points that it's a round by round scoring, which I'll show you in just a little bit, and then 5 points for their overall participation. There's also kind of a final assignment for them to do after this simulation is over, in which they do an industry analyst call, and I'll describe that in just a little bit. And then they have company scenarios, which I'll also describe, 2 of which they do as a team and 1 that they do as an individual. We're able to use that individual to assess assurance of learning and to be able to determine whether or not they're able to write business documents well on their own. The knowledge checks are quizzes that are over the reading so that I don't have to spend a lot of time focused on the things in the textbook. And the Capsim Exam is also a heavy part of their grade, and that's the exam that's associated with the simulation. They get some participation points through a discussion using a tool called YellowDig. The live sessions are our weekly class sessions, which they can either attend live or they can watch the recording, and that's 6% of their participation throughout the course. And then I have them do some reflection at the end of the course to be able to find out what kinds of things went well for them, what kinds of things they learned, and what kinds of things I can do to improve the course in the future. I also provide them with a lot of resources that they can use in getting ready to use the simulation. I create a video that walks them through each of the resources, and I provide them with links to things like the team member guide and the situation analysis and a sample career report so they can start to recognize the things that they have at their fingertips to be able to be successful in the simulation. In an online environment, it's really important that you provide these kinds of written resources for them and some explanation around the actual resources themselves. Each one of those documents, they can either download and print, or they can just expand them or link to them, and they'll be able to have access to those readily. I also create, you see a link there to a Strategies for Success page, in which I'll talk in just a little bit about how I use that to help them to be successful. The next thing that I do is within each week, when I'm telling them about the things that they're going to be doing that week, at the very beginning of the week, I list the objectives for that week. And within those objectives, some of them are related to other activities they're doing within the course, but then some of them are specifically related to the things that they're going to be doing in the simulation. And so trying to write those objectives in such a way that they understand the things that they're going to be doing, as opposed to understanding or gaining conceptual knowledge. The next thing that I have them do is a strategy selection that they write as a team. And so I give them some examples of why this is important, what they need to do, and I give them access to the Capstone Strategies guidance document. And I encourage them to go through and look at all of the strategies and to identify one in which they feel like they can align all of their decisions within the simulation to that strategy. I do warn them if they're feeling a little bit hesitant to pick one of the more simple strategies to follow, but I also express to them that if they follow the strategy, they actually can be equally successful regardless of which strategy they choose. I ask them to write out the things that they'll include in their strategy, and specifically focusing in on the logistics of how their team plans to communicate and make decisions. Once they start simulation rounds, I encourage them to look at the reports and the dashboard that they have within Capsim, and that's the screen that you'll see on the left, where they get their stars based on how they perform in the rounds. But then I also put that information over in Canvas because that allows me to give them some more individualized feedback on how they did and maybe some of the things they could consider to adjust their strategies. They do, in this course, it's an 8-week course, so they do 6 rounds of the simulation. And after they've done 6 rounds, then they I score them overall based on the balanced scorecard. And I'll show you that in just a moment. One other thing I wanted to mention about the round by round scoring is that because I know that making decisions is the most important thing for them to do, I actually give them points just for participating in the round. So that's their base points that they get. So they get half a star for each of, or half a point for each of their stars that they earn, but they get 1.5 points simply for participating. And that's because some of the simulation decisions that they make, if they're following a particular strategy, they may not be earning stars in the very beginning. So it's unusual for students to earn 5 stars every round, but I want them to have something to, for them to understand that as they go round by round, their strategies, if they follow their strategies, they're going to be advancing their success of their company, and therefore they'll earn more stars over time. This also gives me the ability to, if we have a student who reports that or that their team members report that they're not participating and we've had a conversation and they're still not participating, it gives me the opportunity to be able to pull those points back from that individual until they start performing. The overall performance, I mentioned that I use the balanced scorecard within Capstone. In this way, I'm able to look at the long-term changes that they do, their long-term performance, and give them points after the end of round 6. I give them the information about the balanced scorecard and how to be working towards those points early on so that they understand what they're working towards. Another piece of the course that I do is beyond the numbers scenarios, and I'll show you an example of one in just a minute, but basically these are scenarios where we take the information that's in the simulation and extrapolate beyond that information to help them to make the kinds of decisions that are very difficult to program into an algorithm. So for example, if we talk about bring in the bots, that case, that scenario, is one in which the students are having to increase automation. And when they increase automation, that necessarily means that then they are not going to need as much staffing or employees, and therefore they're going to have to make some decisions about how they manage that change when they have to do the layoffs. And so I'll show you the specifics of it. So in this scenario, it has some information about them moving to automation on the low end, and the company leadership is all very excited. This is great. We're going to start this new automation. It's going to increase our profits, and that's great, until they start talking to human resources and they say, hey, wait a minute, some of these things mean that we're going to have to lay off some people. So let's talk about that, and let's figure out some ways that we can make this a better transition for our company and for the community. And so they are then, as a student team or as an individual, are asked to provide a report to the CEO that not only identifies all of the relevant stakeholders, but also talks about communication channels and how to interact with those people, whether it's an individual face-to-face meeting, a group meeting, whether it's messages to the media, letters that might be sent out to employees and things like that. Within that, they have to identify what those messages are, and then some ideas for how they could either retain or retrain the employees. And this allows it to go beyond just a numbers decision that's done in the simulation. I let them know how I'm going to be looking at scoring. So I will tell them there's no one right answer, that there's a lot of ambiguity and flexibility in how they respond. And I also give them the questions that I'm hoping that they answer, and that as I'm looking through their assignments and what they've submitted, these are the things I'm going to be giving them feedback on. So here's an example of a submission from one team. And so they start off their report with talking about the messaging channels and their stakeholder groups. They then move into giving the examples from each of those areas. So they have a key message for the workforce, the line workforce and production leadership. That's a letter that I've included a screenshot of. It's a longer letter than that, but they've provided that. They've also included offers and services for affected employees. They've walked through some of the things that those employees might need to consider. They've included messages for their social media. They've included, it looks like it's missed one of our screens. They also had some other information to the community and how they would retrain and reskill some of their employees, as well as working with local facilities, either through the library or through the community college, to help employees to advance their skills to be able to either move up or move on. Another assignment that I accompany with this is the industry analyst call. And this is, in the past, I have used kind of a board report where they would provide an executive summary and a PowerPoint file that they would use as if they were presenting to the board. This time I'm switching over to an industry analyst call in which they are paired in teams, and they have to, each team has to first take a turn as the management of a company, and the second team would take the role of an industry analyst. They record a video of them talking, first of all having a presentation, and then having some back and forth and questions related to the recommendations. And then they switch roles and do it again. So they're using the data from their Courier reports to back up their claims. They're making sure that they address the questions of the analysts, and then I'm scoring them after watching their video recordings. They're doing those videos through like a web meeting tool like Zoom or Hangouts or whatever they have access to. Then as I'm going through and scoring it, I've got a rubric that specifically outlines the things that I'm looking for, whether they're providing the context, whether they're talking about their company's performance, and making future direction plans, and then actually how their presentation looks visually, the information that they portray, the organization and quality of their presentation, and then their response to their analysts, and then this questions that they pose as analysts. We also have the Capsim exam. I mentioned that earlier. I give them a few days to be able to do it, and explain to them from the very beginning of the course that they will need to make these decisions on their own, and that they'll go through 4 rounds within that simplified simulation and have to make decisions, and also those decisions will lead into queries that they'll do, multiple choice questions that they'll do related to the decisions that they're making. I know that the Capsim has some criteria in different areas. I've aligned those to our assurance of learning, and then I take the information from the Capsim report and I give them their scoring criteria as well as feedback on how they did individually. This is really helpful for them to understand how they aligned within our assurance of learning and how they were measuring up in the decisions that they were making. So I mentioned that we do weekly live sessions. Those are also recorded for the students who can't participate. They can either participate live, and if they participate live, they are marked as complete in doing that. If they are not able to attend live, then they're able to watch the recording, and the system marks them as complete after watching the recording. The structure that I use with the live sessions is really a good way of keeping our class on schedule. We go through, first of all, just an introduction. I try to use more casual interaction at the very beginning in order to be able to develop a community. So we talk about how things are going or some of the news or things like that, just to be a little bit more similar to when you are in a face-to-face environment and you might have some casual conversation before class. We do some housekeeping at the beginning of the session just to make sure everybody is aware of upcoming events and activities, and to answer questions that people might have in terms of things that are happening in the course. We then do, I hesitate to call it a lecture because it's not really a lecture, but it's a content presentation based on the topic of the week. And so I have usually some slides. I'll share my screen and I'll talk through some points and pose some questions. And then they do a breakout with a small group of other students to have some conversation around that content. Usually I'll pose a set of questions. They'll go into the breakout rooms for 15 to 20 minutes. I'll ask them to assign someone who can report back out to the wider group, and then they'll come back and we'll have a shorter conversation about some of the main things that people talked about in their breakout groups. And then I finish up the live session with a capstone tutorial. Here's some of the topics that I've covered in the past, just an overview of Capsim to help the capstone to help them to understand the interface and how they make decisions. A deep dive into things like forecasting, automation, awareness and accessibility, product positioning, and total quality management. These are things that I'm able to dig a little bit deeper in. All the information is in the guide or in the interface, but it's a little bit challenging for them until they really understand how those particular pieces of information relate to the decisions they're making. And so I'll walk them through that. They also can go back afterwards and watch that recording over again several times. And I have had students do that if they have particular questions or if they don't quite understand a concept. Here's a slide deck screen of the kinds of things that I'll talk about, say, for example, in the total quality management. I'll talk them through the purpose, the impact, how to know how much to spend, some of their decisions and how they enter them, and then answer any questions that they have. I'll point out to them particular places within the simulation where they can find the information that they need and how they can analyze the results and how they can pay attention to what their competitors are doing as opposed to only focusing on what they are doing. So I mentioned that I use teams, and some of the things that I use to support teamwork. In this case, I've put them kind of all in one screen so that you can see the things that are, I think, particularly helpful for effective teamwork. So in the very, very beginning of the course, I do a team survey. And in the team survey, I'm asking them things like what time zone they live in, some of their prior work and leadership experience. I also ask them to identify their strongest and weakest functional areas. And this isn't because I'm necessarily trying to make sure that each team has someone who's strong in finance, but it's more about trying to make sure that I have a mix across the teams. And the most important thing in my experience has been to make sure that they're in similar time zones so that they can more easily schedule and work together as a team, because it's really, as I express to the students, it really takes a commitment to their team. Now, the good thing about that is that if they are working well as a team, I have had so many of my teams who have reported out that this is the best team experience that they've ever had, that they've really appreciated working with each other, they've gained so much from each other's background, and that they're going to stay connected as a team beyond the course and even beyond the program. So that's all positive things for us. They conduct a number of practice rounds as a team, and then we go into a session where we debrief how they've done so that they can start to recognize how they work together. The strategy selection document I talked about already includes logistics for working together, and if they don't put enough details in that document, I ask them to think about it a little bit more and to give more information about how they're going to work together. The teams that work together the best are the ones who recognize that you can't just do one weekly call and make all your decisions at the same time, that they also need to have a document for tracking some of the things that they're doing, They need each person to take responsibility for preparation for a particular area before they come together. And they also need a quick way of getting in touch with each other. A lot of them will use text or WhatsApp or something like that to be able to stay connected to each other throughout the week. I also continuously remind them how important it is for them to collaborate with each other versus that divide and conquer mentality. And in the beginning, they are more leaning towards the divide and conquer, but as they start hearing from me over and over again, and as they start experiencing that collaboration, that tends to lead to them actually having better team behaviors. I also share with them past team reflections and lessons learned. I'll share with you some of those in just a little bit, but them being able to see that other students have these lessons learned and have recognized the benefits of working together has seemed to be really important and a good way to help them to understand what they need to do. I do use Teammate built into the simulation after rounds 3 and 6, and that asks them in round 3 to evaluate how well they worked both themselves and their team, and then to give that feedback to each other. I tell them that in round 3, that feedback should be something that they look at in terms of how can I make things better. And in round 6, it's more how did I do this? And then the other thing that I'll describe in a little bit more detail here in a second is the mid-course team check-in. And so as I mentioned, students were a little bit hesitant to ask for help. The mid-course team check-in was something I implemented a couple of semesters ago, and it's been really successful. So the details of that are that I require them to meet together as a team synchronously. We use Zoom, and if there are team members that for some reason can't attend, we do record it, but I strongly encourage them all to attend. And usually with small teams of 3 or 4 or 5 people, that's not too challenging for them to be able to work out. I make very personalized and guided analysis of their team's decisions. And but a lot of the time what I'm doing is I'm pointing out to them an issue and asking them how they would solve that problem. So they might have had 2 rounds in which they didn't have a star for their contribution margin. And so I might ask them, what are some of the things that you could be doing to increase your contribution margin? And so it's personalized to their team's decisions, and it's guided in that it's asking them to reflect and to consider ways that they can solve their problems. I also share with them on the page some of the common issues and strategies for reflections from other people in terms of the things that other people have found to be a challenge, whether it's they all got together and agreed too much, and so they needed to be a little bit more willing to stand up to each other and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't agree with this decision, and let's talk through it. Or whether they didn't spend enough time analyzing the competition, they spent more time analyzing their own problems. So this information is really helpful to get them thinking through the things that they need to do, but also early on in the semester or in the term, having them check in and force them almost to be reflective on what they're doing. I also mentioned that I collect and share strategies from past teams. This not only in the reflection gives the students the opportunity to reflect on what they've learned, but it allows me to reuse questions that other students have had because they're pretty common. And so I basically can include the question there as well as my answer, and I don't have to go and re-answer the question over and over again. I create pages for strategies for success in all the different areas. And if I get a new question in a topic that hasn't been asked before, I'll just add another page. For example, this semester, I had a student who asked a question about R&D that we hadn't answered in the past. And so I built out a page for the students. And instead of just answering them back in an email, I answered it on that page and then pointed them to that page as well as let everybody else know that that page was available. So by answering online and in public, I don't have to answer multiple questions, or I don't have to answer questions multiple times. And that saves me a lot of time. Here's an example of a page that I created for the forecasting. So the student had a question, I gave them the answer, and then I don't have to go back and answer those questions again. It also allows me to do things like build in little tips for them about things like, say, phasing out a product. There are areas where I've seen students trip up before, and it's a way for me to build in a response that includes that warning to them. And then I mentioned that I have them do a reflection. These are the types of questions that I ask them to respond to in their reflection, and specifically looking at, what did you learn from the course, but then what did you learn that you found in the simulation that you didn't learn from the rest of the course activities. And this has been a really great question to ask them, because they start to recognize, if they hadn't recognized it before, they start to recognize what they've gained from an actual experience as opposed to what they could have gained from reading or even from their prior courses. So in this, I'm putting the emphasis on what the students are doing. I'm spending a lot of time encouraging them to practice and to ask questions about what if. I encourage them to create a spreadsheet where they can put numbers in and think about how those numbers will impact, and then to talk to each other and play that out in the simulation. Also giving them support in the debrief, but letting them struggle through the rounds with the resources that they have. This is a little bit different than probably what I would do if I was, or what I've done when I've been in a face-to-face environment, where I might be more there for them to ask questions while they're making decisions. In this case, I'm doing more of facilitating them reflecting and learning from it, which I actually think works better for the students because they learn more. So my role as the instructor is to provide a lot of timely and detailed feedback, facilitate their own thinking and problem solving and use of the resources, as opposed to helping them to come up with the right answers at the time. And then I mentioned the student feedback. Here's just a few of the responses that I've gotten from students as they talk through the value of learning from the simulation. Specifically, they're saying things like, I realized that all of these decisions are interrelated. I recognize that the departments are interconnected. I understand the ramifications of or repercussions of a decision on multiple facets of a business. And so they recognize this by doing as opposed to by reading about it. And so that's where the value of the simulation is as it comes in. So that's a description of that one course. I'm happy to answer your questions or to give you more details or information. Eric, how do we go ahead and start addressing some of the questions that have come up?
Thank you very much, Tawnya. Now, we had several questions about the beyond the numbers cases that you mentioned. I just wanted to start by telling everybody that that content is included. It's included in what's called our Capstone bundle, and that premium content is currently free through June 2021. So if you liked those beyond the number cases or any of the other materials in the bundle, you do have access and you are free to use those in your courses this term. Let's see, there was a good question I wanted to ask you. Bear with me one second. We got a lot of questions in the chat. The gist of it was this professor has graduate students that have very little business background, and they use Capsim Core to help introduce those business concepts to the students. Would teaching that course online create any new challenges for this person as opposed to doing it in the classroom?
Eric, that's actually a really great question. I don't believe that it would. We actually, in our introduction course in our MBA, we have a course that uses Capsim Core. And I've also used Capsim Core with undergraduate students at the end of their undergraduate degree. And in both of those cases, In the graduate level, they don't have all the core courses out of the way yet. And in the undergraduate level, they really don't have any experience, and core has been a great solution for them. It doesn't have as much complexity as Capstone, and it also, the interface is a little bit cleaner and easier for the students to follow. And I think it works really, really well.
Awesome. Now, this question's similar, but this instructor doesn't teach a graduate course like the one we were just looking at. I know you also have a lot of experience using this with undergraduates. This instructor's asking, an undergraduate course is more complicated and challenging, and it takes more time for students to understand the simulation and get used to any of the related assignments. Any tips?
Yeah, absolutely. In an undergraduate course, I've taught it as a full semester course, and so it allows you to spread out the rounds a little bit more, which is very helpful for the students who are just getting used to the interface. The other thing that I've done is in an undergraduate course, I have given them up to 8 practice rounds and allowed them to roll back around. And so that means that they can make some decisions, see, oh my gosh, that was a terrible decision. I got an emergency loan and I need to fix this. And rather than just trying to come out of that, they are able to roll it back so that they can then make those decisions again. That's a really good strategy for undergraduate students. And it also allows them to have a little bit more confidence moving forward. Now, I do make it clear that once they go into the competition rounds, that those aren't allowed to roll back and that they do have to take responsibility for those decisions. So they put a little bit more personal investment into making the right decisions, but it's really helpful to do in the practice rounds. The other thing that I would do is, especially if it's an online class where there are students who are of differing levels and of differing time zones and not much work experience and things like that, that you could run it in a foot race mode where the students can kind of progress at their own pace. But if you do that, you do need to make sure that they have specific timelines that they have to keep up with in other ways in the course so that they're not putting all of their work effort into a specific like 2 weeks of time or something like that. So do pace the course in terms of keeping them on track, but give them the flexibility to do a lot of extra practice, roll back rounds, and then work on their own in the foot race type of mode.
Awesome. And let's see, do you recommend a tournament or foot race for an online class?
Well, I've used both, and I think it depends on the situation. When I was teaching the undergraduate course, I did it as a foot race. I felt like that was the best way for those students. But in terms of the graduate course, that's a capstone course, I do it in tournament, partially because they are a little bit more able to handle the complexity of making decisions as a team. But I also think it adds a little bit of an incentive because they're very competitive and they want to do really well. And if they're just playing against a computer, they don't feel like they're doing as much as if they're playing against their peers.
Awesome. And I know over the years I've worked with a few clients that will actually use the individual delivery for practice, and then they'll form groups for the competition. Now, do you think foot race or tournament is more conducive for an accelerated course? Let's say we only had 3 to 6 weeks to deliver the sim.
Well, I haven't done it as fast as 3 weeks. That would be a bit challenging. Not necessarily undoable, because I have done it where it's been a full day, and we've run it with an executive education in a full day, and it's just you've got shorter time windows to be able to do the rounds. In terms of whether it's foot race or tournament, in that context, I think it just depends more on the student level and the student background as opposed to the time.
Makes sense. Now, can you tell us what LMS do you use? And I believe this is where you have all your content housed, right?
I do. It's housed in our Canvas LMS, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Canvas does anything in particular that another LMS wouldn't be able to do. In terms of how I build the content out, I'm just using pages within Canvas, or you could do the same thing in Blackboard or Moodle or any other LMS. In terms of the link to Capsim, I'm just using a URL redirect, so that can be done in any LMS. And the scoring and the rubrics are Canvas, what you saw on the screen, but you could do the same thing in pretty much any LMS.
Excellent. Now, are there any other tools embedded in the LMS that you use in your class?
I do. So I mentioned the Yellow Dig discussions, and so I use Yellow Dig as a discussion tool. It's a social media, or not a social media, but a social discussions platform. And so it's not a traditional threaded discussion platform, and it is more able to do a dynamic kind of discussion forum where students are able to participate, and I can configure it so that it auto scores their discussions. I like to use that in terms of this course because they're able to bring in things that are of interest to them, and then topics that are really interesting get a lot more discussion than topics that are not so interesting. And the students who start interesting conversations get to have more dynamic discussions, but then they also get more credit for being a more lively part of the discussion.
Excellent. Now, let's see, we've gotten through most of the questions. I do see another here. Do you have any suggestions for helping students understand the basics of how to participate, especially for undergraduates who are not native English speakers?
Yeah, I've actually had a number of students who are not native English speakers, and I find that the online environment is easier for them to navigate and to deal with than they do in the face-to-face. And that's because if something's recorded, they can watch it multiple times. If something's written, they can reread it multiple times. If instructions or information is available for them to do over, then it's a lot easier than in the face-to-face environment where they're trying to keep up in real time with things that they don't understand clearly. So I do find the online environment to be better for them.
Okay, I see a couple more, and it looks like we're coming up on the end of Q&A. This one I've heard many times, which is I struggle with how much to help my students with their decision making. Any advice?
Yeah, I've gone through the same thing. I think in the beginning I was more I tried more to dig into their decisions. I would go into the team view. I would go and try and look through their decisions, and I would try and read through all their reports to answer their questions. And I started recognizing that I was getting lost in doing all of that when really they would gain more value from doing it themselves. And so I pulled back a little bit, and I think that the students have learned a lot more because of that. So when I pull back, I don't mean that I just leave them to kind of struggle on their own as if they were just jumping into the deep end of a pool and drowning. But what I do is I offer them resources that they can explore. I point them to places where I see there could be a problem, and I ask them pointed questions to say, well, why do you think this is happening? What do you think you could do differently? Where is a decision that you have not been doing well, but somebody else in your competitive environment has been doing well? Can you look at their decisions as compared to yours? And so in asking those kinds of questions, they tend to learn more than if I just jump in and say, well, if you look at this, this, and this, you'll see why your problem is happening. And I find that it's much more effective to try and point them in helpful directions as opposed to solving the problem for them.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that with us. Are there other options available for individual grading besides the balanced scorecard?
Yeah, actually, if I can jump back in my slides here to where I lined out what exactly I was doing with the scoring. So they have individual scores that they get for one of the scenarios that they write on their own. They also, the quizzes they take on their own, and they get the top 5 out of 7. The reason why I do that is because I want to give them some flexibility if they need to miss one, or if they do poorly on one and then learn to do better on the next ones. I don't want to have each student coming to me and saying, can you fix this one? Can you fix this one? So I just say, look, I'm going to take your top 5. The individual gets the scoring from the Comp Exam, and that's 20% of their grade as well. And then those discussions that I talked about is 10% of their grade. And then whether or not they attend or watch the recordings from the live sessions is another way that they earn points individually. And then finally their reflections. So there's a good amount of the course that is an individual score. And I think this is a balance that I've come to, that the students feel comfortable that the amount of work that they're doing as a team versus the amount of work that they're doing as an individual is fair.
Excellent. Let's see, I'm going to summarize this next one. Have you ever had an online class do a final presentation, and any advice on that front?
Yeah, so the way that I used to do the final activity in the course was the executive report and the board report, and that works okay. But I feel like the industry analyst call is going to be more powerful because they'll actually be getting interaction and questions from each other at the time. And so being able to record them having that meeting together, I think will be a good way for them to be more invested. They're not presenting to me, but they're presenting to each other. And so I think that that'll be a way for them to do a presentation, but they're doing it to their peer instead of doing it as a performance for me.
Excellent. I'm looking to see if there's any more questions coming in. Looks like we have about one more to go. Have you used the success measures from Capstone combined with the balanced scorecard for scoring, or do you usually use one or the other?
By the success measures, do you mean the stars, the star report?
So the STAR report is called the round analysis. I think I saw a question about that earlier. That's actually one of the scoring metrics. The success measures are a different grading option where students put a weighting on things like cumulative profit and stock price. Do you use the scorecard in lieu of those?
I do the scorecard for the overall analysis of how they've done throughout the simulation. I do this the STAR report for the round by round.
I really like that, especially early in the simulation. I would just make a comment that the round analysis is very easy for students to digest, and as simple as it is for earning a star for things like having margins above 30% or making a profit, you'd be amazed how well earning those stars on the round analysis translates to success on the balanced scorecard. So I think there's
I would agree with that as well.
Excellent. I think that brings us to the end of Q&A, and that will conclude our webinar today. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and thank you especially Dr. Means. And please, everyone, be sure to have a great day.
Thank you.